Growing up on the west coast of the United States at the tail end of the 1990s technology boom, a strange notion was ever present, the notion of the edge. I found that in the minds of locals living in the Golden State, both young and old, possessing this edge was something of a secular cult. Brilliant scientists and rich Silicon Valley entrepreneurs were cutting edge. Big-budget filmmakers from Hollywood were always bringing their audience to the edge, and what successful comedian, or teenager for that matter, didn't consider their humor to be edgy? The edge was the place everyone wanted to be, a place at the forefront of human endeavor, the limit of what had been achieved, and the beginning of what was possible. The edge wasn't easy to define, and it certainly wasn't safe. In fact, as the writer Hunter S. Thompson warned, the edge could only be described vaguely, since everyone who really knew what it was had already toppled over it. Still, the edge was the place of life, the place where things happened, and the place where people made names for themselves. Even the landscape of the state seemed tuned to the notion of the edge. In California, the featureless plains and deserts of Middle America became transformed into a land of fresh agriculture, novel lifestyles, and technological innovation before finally meeting the abyss of the Pacific Ocean. Here, within a narrow strip of tasteful villas, fluctuating corporate parks, and cliffside urban metropolises, lay the home of true innovation, the only place where genius could emerge, and, as I thought, the only place where interesting stories happened to people. Yet halfway through my 20s, during an attempt to find my calling with a degree from a university tucked away in a Midwestern town, I encountered a place entirely separated from the hum of those living on the edge of things. This was not the dull world of Walmart consumerism, nor the fevered swamps of evangelical fanaticism, which so plagued the nightmares of blue state denizens of that era. This place wasn't even the land of plain and honest folk, described in Garrison Keillor's Lake Wobegon. It was something apart, mired in its own haunted history, and possessing a quality absent from locations more in tune with the spirit of the age. Such places are not easy to notice. Indeed, I might have missed it. All universities, regardless of their location, exist on the edge of things. They bask in the glow of the novel, and erect monuments of chrome with academic programs designed, as one pamphlet put it, to push the boundaries of human possibility. But in this new home, locked in the orbit of one of Michigan's largest rust belts, a curious individual could observe the seams of the modern world built into the landscape of the Detroit metropolitan area. Half a century into its decline as a manufacturing capital, Detroit in 2008 was twisting in the winds of a financial crisis that had swept the rest of America. As such, the city was gripped by a stagnation that a denizen of Seattle or San Francisco could hardly imagine. Engulfed in a notorious crime epidemic since the early 70s, the Detroit of the late 2000s had somehow burnt out, transforming into a deserted landscape with a barely active downtown, surrounded by miles of desolate ex-urban neighborhoods and industrial ruins. Those still attached to the city, with any money, had fled to the suburbs, and visited its downtown only for the occasional sporting event, interacting as little as possible with the urban reality that most considered as unfathomable as it was unsolvable. Then, local news seemed filled with bizarre stories from the city, fully functioning homes selling for dimes and nickels in semi-deserted neighborhoods, abandoned multi-story commercial buildings excavated to find the bodies of long-dead junkies in their elevator shafts, and the humorous story of a local comic journalist completing an 18-hole pickup golf game across downtown, unperturbed by authorities. The city had become a type of wilderness, embodied most notably in Ford's Michigan Theater, once an Art Deco jewel, now a rain-swept ruin, with plants growing in between the seats where glitzy theatergoers would have sat 50 years before. But outside the urban devastation, there remained a manner particular to the region. Burning in the hearts of those who remembered better times was an animation that would be exceptional even in the most sentimental small-town community on the West Coast. At first, the attitude came off as a mix of nostalgia and self-righteousness, but nevertheless, it contained a warmth and cheer that I have since associated with the term Middle American. Often, Californians traveling out of state expect to find places totally assimilated into West Coast mannerisms, spread far and wide by Hollywood. But in some places, one can find folk distinct from the America that left the 20th century behind. This quality was less present in the younger generation, who fled from Midwestern cultural attitudes faster than they fled from Midwestern geography. However, among the older folks, living on the outskirts of the post-industrial strip, or holding down a homestead in an otherwise abandoned urban neighborhood, one could get a sense of what was, or perhaps still is, Michiganness. I encountered the quality no more fully than in my friendship with Charles Novak, a short, balding, and bespectacled man in his late 50s, living alone in a private dormitory room in the student housing co-op where I took residence during my career at grad school. Holding an off-balance gait, a lazy eye, balding gray hair, and an overly polite mannerism that would have, in today's college environment, certainly been called out as white, Charlie was an odd character to find in a student dormitory mostly occupied by hip 20-somethings. Still, eccentricities and all, Charlie Novak was a Michigander in the old sense, and it was from Charlie that I received a brief glimpse into a world that I would have never known otherwise. Like many of the Rust Belt's residents, Charlie's father and grandfather had worked in the auto industry and had managed to build thriving lives for themselves with only high school educations. As the first of his family to attend college, Charlie carried his parents' hopes for upward mobility until an early life stroke nearly killed him halfway through his degree. Upon recovering, Charlie managed to muddle through his college years with his radical political convictions intact and absolutely no professional ambitions otherwise. And so, after graduation, Charlie stayed put in the socialist living experiment he had joined in the 1970s, long after his peers had moved on. Charlie seemed a man whose development was frozen at the cusp of adulthood, just at the point in life when his father and grandfather would have found meaning with marriage and a stable, unionized job. Not that Charlie was morose or distant, he remained ever outgoing and gregarious, with a childlike enthusiasm for new things. But in spite of this, Charlie was stationary. He could not confront the changes required by his life and times, and so, Charlie stayed put, year after year, in the student housing co-op as generations of students passed by around him. But with all his eccentricities, Charlie was well adjusted in a sense. Despite his continuing health problems, he had obtained a career driving a taxi across the Detroit metropolitan area. The occupation was close to ideal. In addition to covering his expenses, the work as a cabbie provided him with a collection of second-hand stories taken from passengers and a nocturnal sleeping schedule, which, on most days, found him eating his dinner with the dormitory night owls, still socializing long after the regular workaday people had gone to bed. Most of my contact with Charlie came during late nights, when a desire to procrastinate brought me to the dormitory kitchen to socialize. There, nursing cups of tea and feasting on dinner leftovers, a company of insomniacs, late-night gamers, night shift workers, and, of course, Charlie, collected around the central table to shoot the breeze in the light of a single overhead fixture and the glow of the kitchen pilot lights. Charlie showed up late to these gatherings after finishing his taxi rounds, joining those gathered with a wide smile and a howdy before jumping into whatever discussion was underway. Residents often excused themselves when seeing Charlie, realizing that if they had stayed up long enough for his arrival at the table, it was far too late indeed. Moreover, Charlie's presence in a conversation marked a distinct decline in focus. Seldom being interested in the more controversial subjects that occupied other co-op residents, Charlie often shifted the discussion to more human fare, which usually included questions concerning people's personal lives, local and co-op history, and Charlie's own accounts of transporting passengers from one end of Detroit to the other. Even for one loath to leave a good discussion, Charlie's digressions were usually more interesting than the controversies they replaced. Looking back, I remember hearing, in no particular order, a tale of late-night witchcraft taken from one of Charlie's passengers claiming to be a voodoo priest. Business advice Charlie had received from a local pimp using his taxi to ferry prostitutes to suburban clientele, and an advanced conspiracy theory concerning Detroit's then mayor, Kwame Kilpatrick, that Charlie claimed to have pieced together by eavesdropping on political insiders. Other stories included the time that Charlie worked as a temp roadie for the band The White Stripes, before they were big, Charlie assured us, and one extended tale of his encounter with a local crystal-worshipping cult. One expected an element of tale-telling in Charlie's accounts, and this provided his stories with a theatrical dimension. As the last of the gatherers broke away each night, Charlie punctuated the talk with a coda, cheerfully announcing, "To be continued," as the last co-op denizen retired. The expression was so popular among those who knew Charlie that "to be continued" became a general conversation stopper in the co-op, a wink of recognition among the late-night crew and those who knew Charlie in other contexts. But for all the myriad stories told at late-night gatherings, I spoke to Charlie in private only once. Then, wandering into the co-op's common area at some ungodly hour, following a collapse after a 2-day studying binge, I found Charlie sitting alone, long after the other late-nighters had returned to their rooms. Charlie wore a more serious disposition than I ever remember seeing, and after receiving an only slightly less than enthusiastic howdy and fixing a cup of tea for myself, I sat down at the common table, wondering if for once Charlie was too tired to launch into another story. I waited, but Charlie said nothing, maintaining a neutral expression. Then, after seeing me shift uncomfortably, Charlie broke a smile and began to talk. "You know, when I was your age, I thought I'd be a writer like Stephen King or something, but it never worked out. I think that when you get to my age, you realize that some people have it and some people don't." "I don't know," I added. "You certainly have stories. Did you ever think of writing them down? You probably could make a book out of that." "Nah, I don't have stories. Not real ones. I have weird things that happen to me. I hear about weird things that happen to other people. But they aren't stories, not like the kind you can put in a book and get other people to read. Strange things just happen all the time. But you can't make a novel out of it. It wouldn't work." Charlie continued. "Stories have beginnings and endings. People learn things. There's a point. Most weird things just happen to people. There isn't a point. There isn't even a way to make it sound cool. Probably the weirdest thing that ever happened to me was..." And here Charlie stopped, as if something had occurred to him. After pausing, he started again, this time in a more relaxed voice. "There was this time, you know, I got lost. People think they know a place, but no one really does. I've been driving around this city for most of my life. I've been a cabbie since the 90s. I've traveled on every street, on every back way and alley. It's like the back of my hand. You don't forget it. You couldn't, even if you tried. But then..." And Charlie paused again. "But then, a strange thing happens. I think it was 2 years ago, in August. Maybe earlier, but definitely summer. I get a call from dispatch for a pickup on Cloverdale. No problem. I'd driven there and back plenty of times. I even know a shortcut. This time, however, as I get off the interstate, strange things start happening. I remember it starts with the radio getting quiet. The music that I have playing fades, and I remember cranking the volume knob up until it doesn't turn anymore. Then, right where the radio voices were, there's this piercing sound. Softly at first, and then growing louder, like something sharp is being drilled through a piece of metal, but somehow the noise is coming from inside the cab, pushing out from the back seat towards the dashboard. So, of course, I slow down, I try to get my bearings, and then I realize I'm lost. Totally lost. No idea where I am. I check the street signs and I don't recognize them. They seem to have names that don't make sense, and the ones that do I can barely read, because as I'm there rolling down the street, the light from the sun starts fading. Everything becomes dim, and I get this horrible panic welling up from my gut. I start sweating so much that I have to wipe my brow every second just to see 10 feet in front of me, and the whole while, that slow piercing sound is getting louder until it feels like it's perched right there in the air, right behind my ear, and I feel it pressing up against my skull. And so finally, I can't go on. I slam on the brakes, don't even pull over. The car is running, keys in the ignition, and I just open the door and jump out of the cab onto the pavement like a frog out of a boiling pot. And then the sound stops. It's like someone hit a mute button, and I stand there for probably 10 minutes, staring at the running car and just hearing my heart pound in my chest. And as I listen, I realize that everything is silent. There's not a decibel coming from the radio or anywhere else on the street. I've stopped right in the middle of a city block, but there are no cars. No car sounds even. There are no voices and no birds. There's just the hum of the cab engine and the wind in between the buildings and the trees. And when I look more closely, I notice not only is there absolutely no one living on the block now, it seems like no one's been living there for a very long time. The street beneath my feet is cracked right through to the earth, and in between the line of my cab wheels there are patches of foxtails sprouting up. The buildings are empty, boarded up, with tree branches jutting right through the windows and roots overflowing the devil strip. A few lots are so overgrown I can't even tell if there's a house or an apartment there to begin with, just huge piles of tree and bramble. And as I'm looking down the street, the blight just keeps going. Torn pickets, dying trees, ruined houses, on and on down the line. Even the sun in the sky is twisted, as if it's behind some kind of mist. It isn't bright and piercing, but faded and uneven, like a penny melted into the sky, until everything in the background is like a dark, dull copper sheet. And as I'm sitting there, an uneasy feeling starts growing, like I'm being watched. I look back at the street again, and then I see, right from the corner of my eye, an enormous beast, sitting, crouched right behind the bumper of my car. The thing is huge. Its frame is half the size of my cab, and it's covered in thick brown fur with mud, like it had just crawled out of some hollow in the earth. And I take a few steps back, half expecting King Kong or something, until I see that it's a deer. A deer? I asked. Yeah, it's a stag. But not like one of those whitetails. This thing is a huge animal with a hulking arch in its back and antlers. You could see the mange and patches in its coat where it had gotten scraped fighting a predator or something. The thing is so close, I can see the flies buzzing around its shoulders and smell odor coming off of its hide. It's powerful. As I'm standing there, a few yards away, I see that this creature is crouched with its antlers down under the cab and is grinding them against the rear of my fender, back and forth, until the whole cab is shaking on its suspension. It's like the thing is trying to fight the car, and doesn't even see that I'm standing right there in front of it. Now, I had no idea what to make of all this at first, but after a few moments of just watching the creature mangle the back end of my taxi, I get this strange notion that the deer, this huge stag thing, is the reason why I'm lost, and that if it goes away, things will go back to normal. Charlie glanced up before continuing. I know it sounds crazy, right? But that's the state of mind I'm in, and in that frame, I decide, right then and there, that I'm going to scare the deer off, shoo the stag back to wherever it came from. So I take a step towards the thing and start waving my arms about and shout, "Hey, you!" I hear my voice echo across the neighborhood, but other than that, nothing happens. The stag doesn't even look up, so I take another step closer and yell again, "Hey, you, get away!" I don't know if it heard me, but this time, the stag starts up on its back legs and rams against the cab so hard that the entire frame is lifted a meter off the ground, and it looks like the vehicle is about to get flipped. And at seeing that, something snaps in my brain. I run right up to the thing, right up to its flank, and yell, "Get away from my cab!" and slam my shoulder right into its ribs. You tackled it? I asked. I know it doesn't make any sense. And to tell you the truth, I don't remember touching the thing, because next thing I know, I'm lying on my side on the street, and the stag is walking towards me. I remember lying there, the hooves sound like metal slabs dropping on the pavement, and at once terror wells up from my gut. It feels like the pavement's on fire, and sweat starts pouring into my eyes again, to the point where I'm not sure which end is up. Then, as I clear my vision, I see the stag there, standing over me. Its hoofs are an inch away from my feet. The thing must be at least 7 feet high to the top of its antlers. And as it approaches, I look up at it, from its scarred hoofs to the wall of its mangled fur, and then to its face. The face is the strangest thing. It's not normal. Right where its eyes should be, there is this brightness, piercing like the sun on an ordinary day. It's like someone had set a flare off just inside the creature's skull that's growing brighter every second, overflowing and overpowering the other parts of the animal, until I can't directly look at the thing, and it seems that the deer's head is nothing but a ball of light set under a crown of antlers. I sit there, waiting for something to happen, and at once the beast raises its head to the sky, opens what I can make of its mouth, and makes like it's going to call. Everything is quiet for a moment, then at once a sound starts rushing out of the creature, like the sound of an ocean, but louder. It's so loud, I think at once that the stag's cry could bring down the entire sky, and I feel the force of it push up against my chest, to the point where I think my heart's just gonna give way. "So, what did you do?" I asked. "What do you think? I find my guts, I get off my butt, and I get the hell out of there. I run right off the pavement, right off the street, back through the lines of houses, through the spaces in the lots where the gardens and the fences would have been years back, right through the tangled trees and brush, across other yards filled with car parts and lawn equipment, and all the while, I know that the thing is behind me, following me. It's not like I hear it coming, I can't hear anything, but still, I know it's there behind me, like in a nightmare. So I just keep going and going until..." And here Charlie trailed off before returning. "I keep going until I can't go anymore. I feel my body caving in on itself from running and climbing. I remember thinking that this is it, I'm done for. Either my heart is going to give out or I'm going to be trampled under the monster's hoofs. So I stop, turn around, and look back. And there, a yard's length away, is the creature, charging forward, leaping over roots and around broken cars. The light from the thing's head is now so bright that its whole body looks shifting and indistinct, consumed in brilliance like the creature is engulfed in a ball of white fire, with solid legs and antlers jutting out of it. And then, staring at the monster, I feel myself evaporate. I don't tap out, there's no feeling of terror, but my will stops. My thoughts stop. Everything stops. And in a second it feels like the creature is approaching in slow motion. The light coming from its body is so powerful, it consumes the sky and the buildings, and then the yard and the houses, and even the ground beneath my feet vanishes, and it's like I'm floating there with the creature and nothing else. Then, as the creature is there, a foot away from my heart, I put my hands forward and grab onto its antlers and start hanging on for dear life. Then everything is blurred. I'm lifted up and up into the sky, floating first, then flying, and then falling off the earth, out of space, and everything becomes dark. The next thing, I'm laying on the ground in a different world, staring upward. Everything is still and there's a calmness in the air. I don't know how long I was out, it seems like hours or days, and for the longest time all I can do is look up. The sky is cleared of the orange hue, and it's blue like I never remember seeing it, a solid indigo. There's a breeze blowing and I hear bees buzzing around my ears. There's soft vegetation beneath my back and a rustic smell in the air. After a moment, I sit up and see that I've landed right in the middle of an enormous vegetable garden. My backside is on top of a zucchini patch, and I have my right hand in the middle of an eggplant that must have broken my fall. I still remember it like it was yesterday, but in that moment, it's like every one of my senses is heightened. Every object around me is vivid. The oak trees are greener than I remember them ever being, and each blade of grass seems sculpted. The fences and houses around me, and even the city's skyscrapers far off in the distance, are like a painting. And when I hear the birds chirp, it's not faded into the background like usual, but distinct, as if I could pick out and point to each song coming down from the trees. Then I remember myself and I stand up in a hurry, looking for that stag thing. But the creature is nowhere to be seen. It's like the whole thing never happened. I can't tell where the monster went, and more than that, I can't even tell which direction I'd come from. It's like I had been dropped right in the middle of that yard and everything that had happened before had been a dream. Then, as I'm trying to get things straight in my mind, I turned to see this girl, standing right there beside me. Charlie stopped and corrected himself. I should say woman, but she's young, not more than 25, with a big sun hat, khaki overalls, and muddy sneakers. She's there with a hoe in one hand and a bucket of fertilizer in the other, just looking on quietly and saying nothing. For a while, we stare at each other, and then she puts down her hoe and takes off her hat. And I know then that this woman is the most beautiful woman that I will ever see. She doesn't look like a model. She's too slight and her hands are too stretched and calloused to look like a girl you might see in a movie or an advertisement. But there's something in her face that's strange, delicate and old. Her hair is braided and matted with sweat, and those parts that aren't look like strands of spiderweb in the air. Her eyes are tired, as if they had had experience that a woman of her age really couldn't have known, and she's wearing a broken smile that seems like it must have a story behind it, but probably didn't. I remember she's standing in place with the wind blowing through the trees, and it feels as if the air around her body might crush her, but at the same time like an invisible strength is holding her in place against the sky like a suspension bridge. And, after a moment, the silence breaks. She asks me, "Are you from the police?" And I say, "No, ma'am, I drive a taxi." She asks me where the taxi is, and I say I don't know. She asks me if I'm hurt, and after thinking about it, I say that I'm all right. Then she invites me in for lunch, and we walk back to a run-down brick house just behind the yard, under an enormous tilted oak tree with flaky bark. Inside, there's a kitchen with stripped walls and buckets of paint and plaster on the floor above torn-up tiles. Lunch is homemade borscht with vegetables from the garden outside. It's delicious, but not too delicious. The food is not some symphony of flavor, but feels like a piece of the background, as much a part of the environment as the sounds of summer birds outdoors and the patchy wooden table where I'm sitting. My host fetches her own meal, and we talk. I learn her name is Sarah, spelled with an H, and that she was born in a Detroit suburb in the 80s. She's from a military family, and during her childhood she moved around every few years. She even got to live in Germany and Japan. After high school, Sarah had things figured out, going to an Ivy League for pre-law until her passion for urban homesteading brought her back to Detroit, managing a farm collective in the middle of the city. I talked to her more about the city, how it changed, how it hadn't, the weather that year, typical stuff, but all the while I feel like there's something important lurking right behind the conversation we're having. My mind's tuned into something, like I'm hearing a message break in from the outside of the universe, and I know with certainty that I'm at a turning point. There is something I need to hear from this woman, some piece of wisdom that she must impart at this time and at no other. I wait for this girl who I didn't even know, to say something profound, and I'm hanging on her words. But our conversation just sticks to the mundane. The city, the weather, the details of gardening. It goes on and I feel an urgency building. Then I ask her the only question I can think of. I ask her, when you came back here to Detroit, did you come back for a reason? Did you feel like you were coming home? Was there something here? And at that, she just shrugs and says, no. She tells me, and I remember this, she tells me, places aren't all that different. Life is the same. There are people, houses, streets, driving to work, doing chores. Things aren't that different anywhere. That's what she says, and I can't think of anything more to ask. The moment passes. And after that, not much more happens. I finish my meal, get my bearings, and say goodbye. Then I find my way back to the street where I had stopped the car. It wasn't even that far away, and my cab was still open, engine idling with the keys right there in the ignition. I guess the only thing miraculous that came out of it after all was that I'd managed to leave an open car in Detroit for several hours without it being stolen. And so I drive home, drink some tea, make an appointment to see my doctor, and that's that. That's quite a tale, I said, seeing that Charlie had finished. It's a strange one. Did you ever go back, try to find the street and the house again? I found my way there a few times over the years. I didn't see Sarah, though. She probably moved on to something else. And the neighborhood where it happened? Just somewhere, Charlie answered. Somewhere in the middle of nowhere. The story has everything. Mysterious omens, a battle with a beast, and a beautiful woman at the end. But it's still not a real story, Charlie replied. It sounds like one to me. But nothing happened. I didn't fall in love. I never saw that girl Sarah after that. I didn't get a new job or move to a different state. I didn't meet God or the devil. I didn't change my religion or even change my morning routine. I just went home and things went on as usual, you know? Weird things happen. The dining room was quiet for a moment as I chewed on the words, listening to the sounds of the dormitory building settling into itself. Then I noticed Charlie had dozed off, and I stood up from my chair. Charlie snapped back. "Oh, I guess I'm not as young as I used to be," he chuckled as he got up from the table. "You know, there's probably more to all of this, but like I said, you get to be my age and just living through it's enough. You can't spend time trying to figure it out." "Perhaps it's to be continued," I offered. Charlie smiled. "Yeah, Dave, it's to be continued." Then he shuffled out of the hall to retire for the night. Things did continue. A year later, I finished my degree, moved back to the West Coast, and got a job at a Silicon Valley company. I changed my politics, I changed my attitude, I even found religion. And all the while, Charlie stayed put, just where he had been for the previous 3 decades. Yet years after moving away, as my memory of Michigan grew more distant, I was still reminded of Charlie and his stories. As a religious person, people often ask if I have had some encounter with the divine. No doubt they're looking for a story like St. Paul being thrown from his horse by a voice from heaven. Unfortunately, as someone who obtained their theological positions from dusty tomes and ruminations about metaphysics, I don't have much to offer in the way of a good tale. Still, I listen to other people's religious experiences with rapt interest, from flashes of light to voices, to more advanced visions of angels and saints. The stories fascinate me, even as I have no such reference for my own life. The stories are human, and at times inspirational, but still, there often seems to be something missing, a dimension of the divine which remains undescribed. And when hearing of encounters with the divine, my mind returns to Charlie's tale of a celestial stag chasing him across the ruins of America's last forgotten metropolis. I had hoped to see Charlie's story captured in a hipster-style podcast like NPR's StoryCorps or The Moth. Although I saw little chance of Charlie ever achieving his dream of becoming a writer, it seemed that someone with a more literary flair might bring his story to the public and give it new life. But then, 7 years later, meeting with an old school friend, I heard that Charlie had passed away, carried off by another stroke when sleeping in the dorm room he had taken residence in 40 years earlier. He was laid to rest alongside his father and mother on a plot in Romulus, Michigan. His late-night tales would no longer continue. News of Charlie's death struck me more deeply than the death of someone I had not spoken to for the better part of a decade should have. But more than his stories, I found my mind returning to the mannerisms and personality Charlie had shown me when we lived together in the same dormitory building. It is true that Charlie was a lost soul in his time, never obtaining his potential and shirking from the challenges of the world. Nevertheless, he possessed a singular humanity, In my travels since, I have met many men and women of superior intellect and spiritual development who obtained great humility and religious insight through years of effort and discipline. But the way of Charlie Novak was that of effortless warmth. It was as if he had, through sickness and circumstance, lapsed into a grace that he can neither explain nor honor. Perhaps what was missing in Charlie's life was a conclusion, a direction to frame the sundry events that had occurred to him between his birth and his death. While no man can know what befalls a soul ultimately, I feel inclined to write a coda, if not for the life of Charlie Novak, for his stories. And while it may be presumptuous to impose a theme upon tales that manifestly had none, I can offer here what little Charlie was able to teach me, telling stories in the early hours of the morning. As humans, we are driven to reach ever upwards, for ambition, for worldly meaning, and for progress. There, we are told, lies greatness and fulfillment. But while these promises tantalize us, they are in reality unattainable, and those living through our modern age are not slow to uncover the ugly truth behind these pretty lies. Yet we persist in our endeavors out of fear. What is static perishes, what is slow is ended by the merciless logic of death and Darwin. Therefore, we flee to the edge of things, to the boundaries of life, and to that which is new and novel. And when we cannot flee anymore, we build temples to honor gods who tell us salvation lies behind the next cutting-edge gadget, the next political campaign, or the next revolutionary social reform. We work diligently, and while we never speak the name of death, he is there behind us as we walk upon life's precipice. But the God of the meek stands apart from our struggle. Fearing no death, he descends to the center of things, to the forgotten countries and the hearts of the folks left behind by our age. As in the beginning, he returns to those living in the valley of the shadow of death. He works unnamed, bearing fruit that is practiced even where it is not preached, imparting wisdom to those who do not know that he is speaking. The unconscious holiness of the middle places is a secret that those on the edge of things seldom suspect. And in all of this, I see some small mercy for humanity when our age recedes and mankind is forced again to look back towards the home it abandoned. Time passes, and like all things striving for prominence, our modern world will pass from history. Then, arising from the center, crowned with horns of light, and animated with the force of a new resurrection, the living God will charge ever outward.